Everybody, good morning. It's a pleasure to see you all here today. I know it was probably kind of difficult waking up today after yesterday's party. So thanks again for showing up. We're going to give you a talk today that's going to be essentially a brief glimpse into the fascinating world of cloud malware. And that's something that we investigate and look at on a daily basis at Proofpoint. We have huge visibility into cloud environments, tens of millions of users, thousands of organizations, and that's going to be the basis for our talk today. Hopefully, we're going to leave you with some interesting insights and takeaways. And throughout the presentation, you're going to see QR codes on the top right corner of the slide, so feel free to scan them. They will lead you to previous publications and blogs that we've published about the topics we're going to cover today. So, quick word about ourselves, although we were already introduced. So, I lead Proofpoint's cloud security response team. We deal with incident response, forensic research, essentially looking into cloud environments to find various kinds of threats, including cloud malware, but various other kinds. My expertise and original or natural inclination is towards threat intel, forensic analysis, and incident response. And I have the pleasure of presenting today with Nir. So, Nir, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so hello everybody, just a few quick words so we can start the presentation. I'm a security researcher in Proofpoint Cloud Security Group. I have 7 years of experience, and as I got presented, I'm a collector of airplane models, so it was a pleasure coming here by plane. So thank you, Confidence, and let's begin.
So without further ado, let's dive into the world of cloud threats. And for those of you who are not that familiar with cloud threats or the cloud threat landscape, we're going to start with a short introductory tutorial about cloud threats, or Cloud Threats 101, if you will. So what you have to know is that organizations have been shifting from on-prem to the cloud. We all know that, we've been feeling that, and everybody today is working with some sort of cloud application or environment. That includes the very vast majority of organizations and businesses. But with that shift, attackers have adapted as well, and they have shifted from targeting on-prem resources or mail accounts, and instead of talking about BC, like we used to, business email compromise, right? You've all heard of that term. We are now talking about ATO, account takeover, and that kind of signifies the shift that the landscape has seen. We are now not longer talking about just attackers trying to compromise email, but they're trying to compromise every kind of resource that's associated with a cloud environment and a cloud account. So what's the next thing that you need to know? Attackers are targeting cloud accounts. They're trying to take over these accounts, like we said, and the threat landscape is mainly dominated by two main threat vectors. So one of them is more statistical in nature. These are your credential variance attacks or brute force attacks, including password spraying, password guessing, various enumeration attacks, right? These are kind of more basic, more sporadic, larger in volume, and usually less effective. And then you have the other vector, which is more precise attacks. We call them precision attacks, usually originating in spear phishing, smishing attacks, and other kinds of very targeted threats. Together, both of these vectors end up targeting roughly 90% of all cloud tenants or organizations using cloud environments. That's essentially everybody. So everybody is targeted. Out of these targeted organizations, both vectors end up compromising over 60% of tenants, and that's based on statistics that we've generated from last year, 2023. The stats look similar for this year so far. So that's a huge risk or threat that everybody needs to be aware of. But what's interesting here is that post-compromise, the risk is just getting higher, because post-ATO, attackers can do a bunch of things. They can leverage this initial access, right? And then perform a huge variety or array of post-ATO activities. We will show you a few examples of post-access threats associated with app abuse and malicious apps. That's going to be the focus of this presentation today. And of course, there's a fairly new world of threats on the scene, gaining in popularity, and this is what we call cloud malware. So this is our emerging threat. And this is a schematic view of a cloud attack anatomy. We used to divide the world into various stages. Today, we kind of talk about 4 main steps or stages that attackers go through throughout the attack chain. Beginning from reconnaissance, right? This is where attackers gather intel about their targets, including email addresses, credentials, organizational roles, everything that could be of use later on in the attack. The second step is, of course, infiltration, gaining access to the targeted account. And this includes those brute force methods that I mentioned, credential theft based attacks, and cloud malware. Remember that. The third step is expansion, persistency, and again, recon. Once attackers gained access to an organization or to a cloud environment, cloud account, they then leverage that access. First of all, they want to maintain the access that they've gained. They want to use it to launch further attacks or to capitalize, and they want to maximize on that access. And the last and perhaps most important phase is monetization, right? So attackers are not just doing that for fun. There's usually an end goal by the end of the process. So they want to capitalize on the initial access and post-access that they've gained, and usually they do this by executing financial fraud, stealing valuable data, exfiltrating sensitive information, sabotaging crucial resources, and even selling access. So you have fraud as a service or hacking as a service, and we see that gaining in popularity. Today we're going to be focusing on these 2 methods right here. We're going to talk about OAuth assets and how OAuth assets or cloud applications are being used by attackers. And these kind of methods fall into the second and third steps of the attack chain. Now, unfortunately, for the sake of time, we're not going to cover every type of OAuth-based attack. We're just going to be focusing on the most interesting ones, the ones that we've identified as the future of cloud threats. This will include mainly 2 categories out of 3. We're going to be talking about abused and hijacked applications, which refers to malicious usage of legitimate assets. And we're going to be talking about malicious applications, which are strictly malicious assets created and utilized by attackers in various ways throughout the attack chain. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. And you're going to see this slide recurring throughout the presentation. These are the cool malicious techniques that we'll be covering, beginning from attacker-created malicious cloud apps, going all the way to sophisticated identity theft and impersonation. But before that, Nir will give us a short recap of what is actually OAuth and how it works.
Thank you, Eilon. Okay, so we have a packed agenda for today, as you saw in the last slide, but let's start with a short story to demonstrate what are cloud apps. So about a year ago, I got engaged, and my wife and I today decided to create a save the date invitation, and we logged into our Canva account. If somebody doesn't know Canva, it's a platform for designers. And luckily for us, there is an integrated feature in Canva that allowing the user to access his own photo on other cloud platforms like Google, Facebook, Dropbox, etc. We decided to use the one that belongs to Google. And when we clicked on this link, we got redirected to authorization page of a cloud application in Google domain. You can see here that the app requests access to my data, my photos on Google. And after I gave permission to the application, I was actually able to see my photos on Google Photos. Those are obviously not my real photos, as you can see. Maybe you recognize some of the pictures here. But with this feature, with this cloud application on Canva, I created a save the date invitation, and we send it to our guest. Very useful, right? Cloud applications are important. And let's talk about what happened behind the scenes right here. So we have 4 main players in the OAuth 2 protocol. OAuth is initials for Open Authentication Protocol. The first actor was myself in my story, the resource owner. And the second one was the client application, namely Canva. After I decided to use the client application, I got redirected to Google, which is the authorization server in the protocol. And the last phase was giving access and actually giving the ability for the client application to create an access token. Access token, it's basically the most important thing that you need to remember here, because this token is attached to every API call that's going to the resource server. And the resource server, where my data as the resource owner is stored, is actually will return the most important data to the application to perform the required actions. In our case, my picture was stored in Google, but what kind of data can be stored? In the resource server, basically everything that stores in the cloud, right? Files, emails, contacts, everything that most organizations are marking those data as very important and sensitive data. So now we have a basic understanding what are cloud apps. And we'll dive into the first technique, which is malicious cloud applications, and we will focus about OAuth consent phishing. What are malicious cloud applications? We saw this diagram maybe a minute ago, but the main difference here is the client application. Here, the client application is owned and controlled by the malicious actors, right? So whenever the resource owner will give access to the application to access his own data, he actually giving permission to the threat actor to access his sensitive data. And the resource owner actually becomes the victim in the story. So this is a very basic kind of attack, and what we saw that threat actors leverage that for phishing, consent phishing attacks. This is an example of email that was very personalized for the victim. It's include like in the blacked out marks, information of the organization itself. And this email looks a little bit fishy, but maybe not that, okay. We see a Microsoft Excel request for the victim, and if the victim will click on the link, the phishing link in the email, it will be redirected to Microsoft own domain. Like, this is a legitimate way. No user probably will suspect Microsoft as a phishing threat, right? And after the user will sign into his account, he will present it with the consent page of the application. We will see many of those during the presentation. So what is the consent page? We can see here an example of Microsoft consent page, and the name of the application, remember it's a phishing, it's 0365 access, and the list of permissions that requested by the user to authorize includes like email access, mailbox, settings, contact, etc. But one important permission that's included in this list is the first one, which is maintain access to the user data. This one is really important because whenever the user authorizes this permission, he basically gives the application the ability to access this data whenever it wants, right? So in case of password reset, MFA changes, it won't help the user because this permission is authorized to the application, and password reset, again, won't help the user. Okay, so this was the basic technique that we're going to cover, and let's move on for more advanced one. This one is actually a pure phishing attack, right? Attackers can use OAuth and manipulate the protocol in order to create phishing attacks. And before we'll dive into what kind of a phishing attack and what kind of open redirection attack, let's cover some basic understanding about the OAuth protocol and the consent link of cloud applications. We can see here an example of a consent link direct to Google. In the first line, we can see the endpoint of Google. That's is the authorization server, if you remember from the beginning of the lecture. And we can see the four more important and the parameters that are required by the protocol. The client ID, which is the unique ID of the application. The scope parameter, this is the list of permission required by the application. And maybe the most important one is the last one, the redirect URI. This parameter points where to redirect the user after he gives consent on cancel the application request. And there are more parameters, more OAuth grant flow, but this is like the very basic and most important one for our cause. So now we got for a very exciting part, the AppPhish. AppPhish is initial for application phishing, and this is an open redirection attack on Microsoft, basically, but there are other cloud providers that can be abused for this attack. And basically, open redirection attacks are cases where the user clicks on a domain of maybe a legitimate server, but just any domain, and automatically and the user will be redirected for a domain that's controlled by the malicious actor, right? He clicks on domain A and then redirected automatically to domain B, which is malicious. So those are open redirection attack. And there is a big question why we saw those kind of attacks with OAuth protocol, right? So there are two main reasons why to use the cloud provider domain, which is very credible domain, and this domain will, and those links will probably go through the defense mechanism of any security solutions, right? Nobody will mark Microsoft or Google as a malicious domain. And since 2022, we saw hundreds of variants of these AppPhish attacks. One example is on the right. In this case, the user got a phishing link of Microsoft Online, and after he clicked on the link, he got redirected to this PayPal Fitch page, and we actually saw many users falling for those kinds of attacks. Okay, but how attackers were abusing the OAuth protocol to create those open redirection attacks? Very simple, actually. If something goes wrong during the authorization process, some cloud providers, again, not all of them, are redirecting the user to the apps redirect URI. But, as you remember, the apps redirect URI is controlled by the malicious actor, right? Is owned by is controlled by the application owner. So we can abuse this flow very basically by just creating an OAuth application, add a malicious website as the apps redirect URI, and then we will generate an app consent link, okay, that will lead to the consent page that we saw before. And this is the important part, we will plant an error inside of the authorization process. What kind of errors? There are many variants of errors, but we will focus on one of them, which is omitting one of the required parameters by the OAuth protocol. And lastly, the attackers will send those links with the errors to their victims, and this will trigger the open redirection attack. And let's see a short demo of how it works. So on the first row, we can see the legitimate consent link of an application. And when we will load this link, as we see right here, we will be redirected to the legitimate app consent page, right? There is no error. But now what we will do is just omitting the response type parameter from the link and try to load this page. And as you can see, we got redirected automatically to the apps redirect URI with an error in the URL bar. And this is basically can be a phish page or an evil jinx page that will phish from the user his credentials, etc., right? It's controlled by the attacker. Sorry. And one last fun fact is this behavior can be achieved with a legitimate link, because some cloud provider as Microsoft actually are redirecting the user whether he decided to accept the application or to cancel it. So the user see the legitimate consent page of the application, and he have no option but being redirected to a fish page as the app redirect URI.
And that's really my favorite part of this attack chain, by the way, or this specific method. You essentially lock the user in a loop and create this catch-22 situation, right? You can either cancel, you can accept. In the end, you will be redirected to the attacker's web page of choice.
Yes, Eilon, very cool. But I expect that maybe you are thinking to yourself, what if the user is aware of phishing? Maybe you won't click on the link and maybe you have some...
People won't fall for that, right?
Right, nobody clicks on phishing links today. Everybody knows that. And there are also there are many security solutions that will maybe mark those links as phishing, and there are also organization policies that can prevent from the user to authorize cloud applications. So what is the next step? How can threat actors can leverage this infrastructure for other attacks? And this is the post-account takeover attacks with cloud applications. We'll cover 4 of those techniques, and let's just dive into those 4 techniques. The first one is post-access authorization of a malicious application, right? We saw this diagram before, and now the resource owner is compromised, right? There are many ways to compromise the user's environment. Let's assume that the attacker got this initial access to the resource owner environment. And what he can do is just basically authorize an OAuth application on behalf of the user, right? He controls his environment. So by authorizing the malicious application that he created before in another environment, he will have a higher persistence to the account in the case of a password reset. And the resource owner won't need any interaction with the user to lead him to authorize this cloud application, right? He can just do it by himself. And this technique was observed in a few years in many campaigns, but one of them, called Vodka Nimbus, was initiated in 2018, but somehow it's still going on, even though we published our findings about this a few years ago. And we actually in this campaign saw something very interesting, which is the CNC server of the attack. We can see here the login page of this CNC server. And when we were able to infiltrate the environment of the CNC server, we saw a list of users that were attacked in this campaign, their passwords, and in the case of a successful attack, we actually saw the access token of the malicious applications. And this demonstrates what is the next level of cloud applications malware, right? This is a fully automated system that will compromise the user environment, maybe by brute force, spear phishing, etc. And later it will authorize, it will log into the user's environment and actually giving consent to malicious applications created before the attack. And now Eilon will go through maybe the most interesting and hot topic of the presentation.
Yeah, so we talked about how you can leverage that initial access, right? Once you compromise an account as an attacker, what can you do with that post-access? And we talked about how you use malicious assets. You can authorize your previously created application, you create new apps, but what about existing applications, right? What about assets that are considered legitimate? So the first use case here would be to use a benign third-party application. And some attackers have figured that creating new apps is just too noisy, right? If you compromise an account and then you create an application, that can be easily detected or relatively easy. So what they do to avoid raising these alarms is use perfectly legitimate applications that are quite popular with users, and then they authorize them post-compromise to gain persistent access to these compromised accounts. So they use popular email clients mostly, but they also use applications with various kinds of scopes and permissions, Some of them have access to contacts, and that raises even fewer eyebrows, right? As an admin, if someone only uses an app that has access to your contacts, but for attackers, that's perfect for internal reconnaissance. Sometimes they authorize applications with access to email, to files, and even more extensive permissions than that. It really depends. But the point being is that they used benign, legitimate applications for malicious purposes. So that's really tough to detect, and a lot of solutions kind of tend to ignore that, right? The policy is already to approve these applications. You're not going to check every instance of a user authorizing a legitimate app. As a result, this method is really quite popular with attackers and only gaining in popularity. But another way of using legitimate apps is actually living off the land, right? You compromise an account, and then you end up with some existing applications, and you have legitimate OAuth assets that already exist within that cloud tenant, and we call that app hijacking. So app hijacking is essentially a living off the land technique based around the concept of using these existing benign apps. Let's imagine the following scenario, right? We have our standard user here, let's call him Bob, and he's happily working within his cloud environment. Now, Bob has created a legitimate line of business app for his organization's specific business needs. Bob is happy using this application. Even other users within the same environment are using this app. And even users outside of the environment, other business associates or supply partners might be using the same application, and they are assigned or connected to different tenants. And we might have users in the future belonging to other organizations and tenants authorizing the app and using it for legitimate needs. So what happens when we have an attacker compromising this initial account, the app owner in this case? So let's imagine an account takeover scenario, and now the attacker has gained access to Bob's account. The attacker has infiltrated the environment, but they have also infiltrated or gained access to the application and its various authorized instances, and that's crucial here. So they essentially infiltrated or hijacked the whole chain here, and that's really quite fascinating, right? Because you have attackers taking control of this line of business app, using its permissions and access token mainly, to execute various actions within the already connected environments. So they can now execute actions within the same internal environment that would constitute lateral movement, right? They can also execute actions within external environments, and that would constitute supply chain attacks. And we still have these potential future users or potential future access to other external environments. So attackers might enjoy even further, more extensive access in the future. And having said all of that, the application still looks perfectly legitimate. There's really no way of knowing that the application is now hijacked or that the access token can be used by attackers to gain access. So you might be thinking, but what are the odds of this attack kind of impacting a credible, security-minded organization? Well, we kind of saw that happening, and amazingly, Microsoft earlier this year has revealed that they were themselves, alongside a bunch of other organizations which were not named, impacted and compromised by the same attack chain, right? So that brings us to this infamous recently published attack, which was attributed to an attacker dubbed Midnight Blizzard. Midnight Blizzard is associated with the Russian military intelligence. And according to Microsoft, the state-sponsored actor managed to use password spraying attacks to compromise a Microsoft test environment, right? So that's not the main environment, that's another environment, not really used, kind of deprecated, and the attackers actually targeted a dormant or inactive account. This account obviously did not have MFA in place, and using password spraying, attackers managed to compromise that account. Once attackers compromised this account, they found an existing OAuth application already authorized by another user, which was assigned to Microsoft's corporate environment, right? And that's the holy grail for attackers in this case. So you have a secondary tenant with a legitimate line of business application that is being used by an external tenant, which belongs to the same organization, but for this purpose, it's an external user within Microsoft's corporate environment. So once this access was established, attackers quickly leveraged it and gained access to the main environment. From that point, they were able to leverage their permissions, and with elevated permissions, they were able to create new user accounts in the corporate environment. Right? So remember that they were using the legitimate applications instance to create a user in the legitimate environment. Why? Once they had a new user, they were able to authorize new applications. And this is what they've done. They created malicious applications and then authorized them with the new user that they created. And now you have a situation where you have new dedicated malicious apps, new dedicated users or user accounts, and this is a game over situation. Once that was established, attackers had access to a whole bunch of sensitive resources. They gained access to internal emails and data. They exfiltrated source code and did some internal recon. And a lot of the details are still to be uncovered.
Thank you, Eilon. That was really fascinating and actually very shocking for me when I saw this campaign firstly. And I think that by now, in this stage, we establish what kind of damage a cloud application can cause, what is the permission set, and what kind of data, etc., etc. And we will talk now about how cloud, our threat actor, were able to gain higher success rate of their attacks by using an identity theft techniques and impersonation. We'll talk about two of them, MACT and MPN abuse. And those techniques were very successful, as we saw. The first technique, which called MACT, is initials for malicious application incredible tenant. This was coined by us in Proofpoint. And those applications were created within a hijacked environment of the users of credible tenant environments. And by using those applications, attackers were leveraging the credibility of the tenants to launch attacks. What kind of attacks? First, they can impact user outside of the environment and using those applications as an infrastructure for targeting other users, other tenants, right? They have higher credibility now. The consent page will look much better and it will yield a better success rate of attacks. And the second option is to actually attack the tenant itself, attack the impacted environment, and that will allow the users, the attackers, to lateral move in the environment. They will use those internal applications to bypass defense mechanisms and definitions which were implemented by the admin of the organization, and also this will lead for an extensive amount of damage. And I talk a lot about credibility on those slides, but how it looks like on the app consent page. We can see in the left here just a demo app that I created for the conference, and Microsoft just put a very big label under the application name, which is an application were created by an unverified publisher. And there is also a comment that this application was not published by Microsoft or the tenant himself. And in case we will see a credible page, a credible publisher consent page, like this one of Slack, we can see that Microsoft present the real domain of the publisher. They will also present the privacy policy statement of the organization, etc., etc. And most of the users, when they will see this kind of page, they will probably click on the accept link and think that they will give consent to a legitimate application owned by a known publisher. But that leads us to the next level of credibility and the next technique of impersonating two tenants. And what the attackers did here is actually abusing a verification process controlled by Microsoft. This is a process called Microsoft Partner Network, or shortly MPN. And in this process, the users and the organization are getting verified by Microsoft, and they will present legal documents of the organization. They will verify the domain, their emails, etc., etc. And by the end, Microsoft decide whether this publisher is verified or not. And in case he is verified, he will actually have a blue badge of authenticity on his consent page. This also belongs to other products owned by Microsoft. And we saw this also a trend in other cloud providers like GitHub, and maybe you can saw it on Twitter, etc. This blue badge is all over the place right now when people really trust this blue badge. So whenever they will see this page, probably they will give consent. And in case we are hackers, this will yield very high success rate of attacks. And there are two more reasons why hackers do want to use this MPN verification process. The first one is Microsoft announced that in 2020, since 2020, the users won't be able to consent applications from unverified publishers, but they are not enforcing it until now. And the second reason is that admins can define a policy where users in the organization can authorize applications just from verified publishers' environment. And that's a big no-no for threat actors, right? They are not able to phish users and let them consent their malicious cloud applications, right? Very annoying. But any hacker, sometimes hacker can go through these processes, and this is not too hard for them. What they will do is just compromise a verified publisher environment, right? We talked about MACT. Those applications are created inside of a credible environment, and in case this environment is verified by Microsoft, that will lead to very cool campaigns, as we saw this campaign of Oy vey voy about 2 years ago. There is very interesting findings in the blog in the QR code, so I really recommend to go to this URL. And as I said, the threat actors were compromising a verified publisher environment. Then they created this application, and you can see here the verified publisher blue badge of the application, and also the domain that is shown seen. We can see here in the consent page is the real domain of the compromised environment, the compromised tenant, and the reply URL is actually controlled by the malicious actor, right? This is a malicious application created in this credible tenant. And finally, in very sophisticated phishing attacks, the application requests link sent to the users, and in this campaign, we had a very high success rate. We observed it that many VPs, CEOs, CISOs, etc. were compromised using this application. But now let's think what happened whenever the threat actor was exposed, right? He will lose his access to this verified publisher environment. This is a big no for really users.
Sucks, right? As an attacker, you lose your operational infrastructure. The whole thing goes down the drain once you've been exposed.
Right. So what will be the next step of attackers, Eilon?
Well, I guess if you can't beat them, right, maybe just become them. And if you want to have that badge of authenticity, why not just earn it? And this is what we've seen beginning in 2022, and that's really quite fascinating. I think this is perhaps the peak of sophistication when we talk about cloud malware attacks. So back in 2022, we actually noticed something really, really interesting. What originally started as a pretty standard investigation into what we thought was a MACT instance, like these classic malicious applications created by another compromised environment that sucks. This organization was compromised. They were already verified, and now attackers are abusing their environment. But once we actually contacted a few of these impacted organizations, or what we thought were few impacted organizations, to let them know, something really interesting was apparent to us, because these were not MACT instances. These organizations were actually able to confirm that everything was fine. They were looking for these apps and they couldn't find them. There were no malicious apps or any kind of malicious access to their environment, and we were really baffled, right? So we continued to dig into this, and what we found really left us shocked, because these organizations were not compromised. They were just impersonated to a really, really high degree of accuracy. And these apps were actually created in strictly malicious environments. And the explanation was quite impressive, because it includes this whole chain of attack that you see before you. So what attackers actually were doing in a campaign that we dubbed Waldo is that they started by creating dedicated malicious infrastructure to support the whole operation, right? So they registered domains impersonating legitimate and known businesses and companies. They then created, obviously, cloud environments associated with those newly registered domains. So you have the infrastructure. They then had the balls to go through the MPN process abuse stage, actually contacting Microsoft to get themselves verified as legitimate publishers. And to our surprise, Microsoft went along with it. They verified these malicious tenants as the legitimate vendors, as the legitimate publishers. And once attackers got that highly coveted publisher verification status, verified publisher status, they were actually able to use it into their advantage, and they started popping up these malicious applications one after another. And they were not only creating applications, they were using obfuscation methods to make these apps look like legitimate apps. So they were using known icons, for example, Zoom. They were using known and familiar application names like Single Sign-On or Zoom or other well-known brands, and they were really abusing several brands within the same attack chain to create what was really looking like the most credible threat that they could use. They then proliferated these threats, targeting a select group of organizations and users, and of course had a very high success ratio, compromising executives and compromising sensitive user accounts. So once they managed to compromise these accounts and the account takeover phase was over, the chain kind of started again, with these accounts being leveraged to proliferate threats, to execute other kinds of fraud, and sometimes to create or authorize OAuth assets and malicious applications, essentially using the methods that we've already covered. So this is, if you will, the perfect attack chain. These are just a few examples of the apps that were used by attackers as a part of the chain, and you can see the impersonation here, how they used all of that. And that's pretty much the peak of sophistication, but
I hope Microsoft did close this flaw in their verification process, right? We actually send them an email and for order to disclose the topic, right? No?
Yeah, so we disclose our findings, obviously, and you would think that, this is really impressive, but this would be a one-off, right? Microsoft would fix the process. No attacker would be able to get verified by Microsoft after that, right? But they did. And we actually saw the same pattern repeating time and time again, with seemingly legitimate organizations being actually attacker-owned tenants approved by Microsoft. So that kind of wraps up the whole story of these techniques, right? And we want to leave you with a few takeaways. So what have we covered? We talked about various ways of abusing OAuth applications. We talked about malicious OAuth applications. We also talked about ways of abusing existing apps, either abusing legitimate popular third-party applications or even internal line of business apps that are already existent. We talked about sophisticated ways of hijacking verified publishers or even becoming a verified publisher. And that kind of gives the sense of a chronological evolution of cloud threats. But actually, this is really not the case, right? So what we're seeing is more of a everything, everywhere, all at once situation, with all of these threats existing at the same time and being used by the same threat actors to execute very efficient attack chains. So everything is kind of being used. There is no replacement of one method by another. Another thing is that cloud malware is really a diverse emerging threat. You've seen a bunch of methods, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. And we saw how it's being used by APTs, by state-sponsored actors, but it's actually being used by financially driven actors, your everyday hacker, just the same. So we're seeing how attackers are using the same tools, the same techniques, and the same procedures, and it's really quite interchangeable, making it more difficult to sometimes attribute these methods and techniques to a certain actor. And lastly, as a key takeaway, we learned that threat intel is crucial. If you want to identify, detect, and remediate in time, you have to have the right intel and contextual information in order to expose and find these applications. You need to sign off on a malicious context if you want to be able to vet what seems to be like a legitimate app. And of course, vendors have to do more to address cloud malware. This is simply not enough, and we've demonstrated that with the MPN abuse. Please feel free to check out our previously published blogs and write-ups about all of these methods, and I think we have some time for questions.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks a lot for elaborating the cloud environment